hearing entertainment today. We could only listen to the FBI, former FBI director, grilled and sentenced here. So good morning. It's 8:30 a.m., June 8th, 2017. I have Dr. David Bagley, the hearing officer, docket 17-4802 in regards to Brook Mine LLC. Present today from the council are Nick Agopian and myself. Council members Fair Service and David Felder have recused themselves. Parties present today are, and again, I'll allow you to introduce yourselves. We'll start with Brook Mine LLC.
Thank you, Dr. Bagley. Jeff Pope, Isaac Sutton, Tom Sansonetti, and Kerry Scott from Holman.
Thank you. DEQ.
Andrew Colvin and James LaRock for the Wyoming Attorney General's Office representing the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality and Conservation.
Thank you. Powder River Basin Resource Council.
Good morning, Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council.
Thank you. Fishers.
Jay Gilbert from Youngkin Toner, and Marion Davis Fisher.
Thank you. And Bighorn Coal.
Good morning, Lynn Boomgarden of Crowley Fleck on behalf of Bighorn Coal, and with me today again is Mr. Jordan Sweeney.
Thank you. Also present for the council are Jim Ruby, Executive Officer, and Joe Gerardin, Council Business Coordinator, and Ryan Shellhouse from the Attorney General's Office. This hearing is being held in the Elk Room, Game and Fish Commission, 5400 Bishop Boulevard, Cheyenne, Wyoming. There is a court reporter present. So today we will continue from what we finished last night. I believe, Ms. Anderson, you have a witness to recall.
I do, and Dr. Bagley, before we do that, I just wanted to note for the record that I have placed over with our exhibits, our demonstrative exhibit 93, which is Dr. Marino's PowerPoint with, which was our already filed exhibit with some additional slides that he prepared for demonstrative purposes. Exhibit number 94D, which was the document Dr. Marino prepared, and then exhibit 95D, which is the PowerPoint Mr. Wireman went through in his presentation.
All right, thank you.
Okay. And for Ms. Spencer, do I need to go there? Okay.
Ms. Spencer, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, this is Dave Bagley. Just to remind you that you're still under oath.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, Sue, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just have a couple of additional questions for you. Ms. Spencer, after hearing Mr. Wireman's testimony yesterday, would you still agree that his opinions and findings meet the standards of a Wyoming professional geologist?
Yes, I do.
And do you have any concerns about lending your Wyoming certification to Mr. Wireman's findings and opinions in his recorded testimony?
No, I do not.
Okay, thank you. That is all I have for you.
Okay, thank you.
Time for cross-examinations. Mr. Gilbert's.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Boomgarden.
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. I just have one question. Sorry. Good morning, Ms. Spencer.
Good morning.
I just have one question for you. Were you able to listen to all of Mr. Wireman's testimony yesterday?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
I was up at 4 this morning, watching it on video.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's my question.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Mr. Pope.
No questions.
No questions. Any questions from council? No. I have none either. Any redirect, Ms. Anderson?
No.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Spencer, and I hope you enjoyed your morning video. Wow. So I
I
believe,
did.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
so I believe you are free to now go about your business for the rest of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any additional witnesses?
I do not. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Pope, do you have any rebuttal evidence you'd like to present?
We do. We would call Dr. Lutu Kuchner to the stand.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and re-swear.
Have you raised your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Kushner. How are you today?
Good morning.
I have three topics I'd like to discuss with you this morning. The first is the Bighorn Coal groundwater restoration demonstration. Were you present when Mr. Gerlach discussed the groundwater restoration demonstration in Sheridan?
Yes, it is.
Did you use the groundwater restoration demonstration in your review of the Brook permit application?
Yes.
How did you use that demonstration?
So I'd like to step back a little bit and explain to the council what this document is and how I used this document to reconcile the pieces of information that I used versus the one that I did not think were applicable in this specific instance. So I think Big Hunt has done some good groundwater restoration at this site and have demonstrated through the Big Hunt Coal exhibit number 15, the groundwater restoration document. So one thing that I'd like to highlight to the council is that the objective of this document is different than the objectives of the Brook Mine Mark Pro. So the objective of the Brook Mine or the Big Horn Mine groundwater restoration document is to demonstrate to the LQD, the Land Quality Division, that the Big Horn Mine has met all the commitments and restored the groundwater to pre-mining conditions. So that's the primary objective of that document. And Brook Mine's objective is, so in Big Horn's case, they are at the tail end of the whole process, the reclamation and restoration process. They have collected about more than 23 years of information of water levels and water quality at those wells. And they are at the tail end of the process demonstrating to LQD as part of the bond release process that the water levels that they've collected in the past is demonstrating to LQD that the current conditions meet the statutory requirement that the groundwater at their site this is capable of meeting the approved post-mining land use, which is livestock in this instance. So that's the situation that they are in. And if you look at Brook Mine, the position that they are in is they are looking at future. They have a good handle on what's right now at the site, but they're trying to predict future. So they are relying on a model to get to the future. And Big Horn is relying on hard evidence, the data that they've collected over 23 years to demonstrate to LQD that everything has been restored, that the groundwater has been restored to pre-mining conditions. So that's the primary difference in objectives between these two documents. With that in mind, so I used, I looked into this document and I made some analysis and decided to use the results from Big Horn Mine's GRD to mostly cross-check and verify what the Markville model has to say, rather than using the parameters that the GRD has used as a supplement for the hard evidence that they have in water levels. So the requirement that LQD had in terms of bond release is whether the Big Horn mine has met demonstrated that the water levels have recovered to pre-mining conditions, the water quality, the groundwater quality is suitable to meet the approved post-mining land use. So how did they do that? They had a set of monitoring wells. They went there every quarter, collected the information over 23 years, and then they plotted a hydrograph. Hydrograph is nothing but the plot of water levels over time. So they plotted this thing, the hydrograph, and that hydrograph clearly demonstrated to LQD that the groundwater levels are back to where it was before mining. So in other words, it's a successful case of groundwater restoration demonstration by a coal mine in this area, in this general area of interest, meeting satisfactorily the LQD requirements. So in that sense, so I used, from that perspective, I used the information that BigCon had in their groundwater restoration document to see, okay, this is an independent analysis that was conducted by BigCon in 2002, and Brook mine comes in like 2015, 16 with this mark from model. So are there lines of evidence that indicate that these two information, are they contradicting each other? Are they lining up with each other? So that's, as a modeler, I think that's one more line of evidence that I'd like to look at. So I think I'd like to point the concept of Big Hunt called exhibit number 15, page number 10.
Let's go ahead and we'll pull that up for you, Dr. Kuchenauer, as you discuss that. Is there, before you jump into your discussion here, is there any particular portion of page 10 of Bighorn Exhibit 15 that you would like to discuss with council?
I'd like to point to paragraph number 2.
Okay, we'll go ahead and blow that up for you.
The second full paragraph. So I'd like to point specifically the statement here that says, the rates may also be biased somewhat high by the assumption that the total recharge period for pits 1 and 2 was only 23.2 years prior to October 2001, when in fact the backfill of both pits was subject to some constant recharge. So I think this is the statement that I relied on. So it tells me that it took 23 years, if not more, for the backfill in the Bighorn mine to saturate. It's not 1 year, it's not 2 years, it took 23 years. So that's the number of years. This is a line of evidence to me that indicated that given that Brook mine is proposing to mine for 12 to 13 years, that puts the 23 years in perspective, how long it took for the backfill to resaturate. And the other thing that interested, and I'd like to look at this is like, okay, so like it's 23 years, given that it's right next to the Tunnel River. They mined the shallow coal using a different mining methodology. So I'm also interested in like, what's the rates that they predict? So we know it took 23 years, so we are also interested in the rates, the recharge rates that came in and filled the backfill over time. So I'd like to highlight page number 41 of the same exhibit to the council. That's a table from Bighorn.
We will go there. Is there any place on this table, Dr. Kuchenauer, that you would like to highlight?
I'd like to highlight several pieces of this table. One thing is, the first thing that I'd like to highlight is on the left, on the right column that you have, if you can zoom in that, please.
I'm sorry, what page is that again?
Page 41. It's Bighorn Coal 15-041.
Thank you. So here, I mean, they show when they started collecting the water levels, 1978, and the last data point that they collected was in October 2001. This is where the 23.2 years is coming from. So if you can get out of the zoom and go to the other portion of the table that shows the calculations, maybe we'll zoom into the first section of the table. So I mean, I want to clarify to the council that this is not a model. It's a pretty straightforward arithmetic calculation based on the information that they collected over 23 years. So what they did is, they know the area of the backfall, area, and they know the depth of the saturated thickness based on the water level information they collected. So they calculated the volume of groundwater that's available in this location. Once you know the volume, and if you know how long it took to reach there, you can back calculate the recharge rates. So I think to make it more interesting, the units that we see here is 0.04 acre feet per day. So I mean, during my direct testimony and the mine predictions, we are familiar with the number of CFS. So the mine did these kinds of calculations for like 4 distinct areas within their backfill, so that we can get an idea of recharge rates on an average over the 23-year period of these distinct areas within the backfill aquifer. So similarly, the other four areas are shown in this specific exhibit. So I did a calculation on the average recharge rates at all these four areas that's presented by BigHorn. I did the unit conversion, so Dr. Bagley doesn't need to pull his calculator out. So it turned out to be like 0.06 CFS. So I'd like to repeat just to refresh our memory from the hearing last week. So the lowest flow that we have seen in the USGS gauging station at Monarch over the past 10 years is 100 CFS. The Brook mine predicted mod flow predictions on the maximum intercepted, potential maximum intercepted groundwater is 0.22 CFS. And this independent calculation that was conducted by BigHorn in 2002 says it's 0.06 CFS. So this is like a good line of evidence that tells me that BigHorn, even with their own field study for like 23 years, shows us a recharge rate that's pretty much in line with, if not conservative, it's in line with the estimates that's provided by Brook mine. And I also would like to highlight the differences in mining methods and how deep these coal seams are. Brook is planning to get into a deeper coal seam. They're like proposing relatively minimal difference compared to what BigHorn did in their mining. So even though there are like differences in the approaches, this tells me that the estimates, the model is a reasonable tool for us to rely on for our predictions. And so we know that 0.06 CFS is what came into the BigHorn mines backfill over 23 years. So, I mean, we are also interested in like, where does this water come from? What's the source of this water? We know it's relatively minimal, but we don't want to discount just because it's minimal. We don't want to know the source of this water. So what does BigHorn has to say about the source of water? So I'd like to point the council to like exhibit 15, page 34.
We'll pull that up for you right now. Is there any place on Bighorn Exhibit 15-034 that you'd like to highlight for the council?
There is a specific sentence that starts with stream flow depletion and tongue river. I think it's 3A2 heading, line number 5, I think. So I'd like to start from the second sentence here. The coal seams, particularly the Monarch, are projected to be the principal source of groundwater recharge to the backfill pits 1 through 3. Stream flow depletion in Tongue River associated with the aquifer drawdown is described as minute, if any, and projected to cease after reclamation is complete and groundwater elevations in the coals and spoil aquifers are recovered. So I'd also like to go back to the cross-section that BigHorn presented in their exhibits, Mr. Paul.
Certainly, that's Bighorn Exhibit 14. We'll pull that up for you.
So this exhibit shows the backfill area. And it shows the Monarch coal seam. That's the line, that's the seam that you see above the yellow shaded, the lines that you see here in this exhibit. So the Monarch coal seam connects to the backfill aquifer. And then there is the Tongue River. So there are potentially two sources. Thank you. So that's the Monarch coal seam. And that's the backfill. And that's the Tongue River. So this exhibit shows that there are potentially two sources of recharge to the backflow. The 0.06 CFS that we are talking about. So what's the primary source and what BigHorn has to say about it? And does that contradict or is it line with what Brook has to say? So they say that in their demonstration that the Monarch coal seam is the primary source and the depletion in the Tongue River is minimal. So that's like one more line of evidence for me from another company that's pretty much lining up with what Brook is saying. And the last one that I'd like to highlight is, I know that the public and the council is interested in like what's going to happen to the alluvial wells. So right now, I mean, we are just talking about the water in the Tongue River, not the alluvium. So I'd like to point to page number 31 of Big Call Exhibit number 15.
We'll pull that up for you. Is there a place on Bighorn Coal Exhibit 15-031 that you would like to highlight?
I'd like to go to this line that says the southern boundary of Brook 3. So I'd like to highlight this specific sentence to the council. The southern boundary of Brook 3 intercepted saturated alluvium of Tongue River along a
You're
length
gonna
of,
have to slow down.
sorry, along a length of about 2,000 feet. This caused the water table in the alluvium to decline over a portion of the valley floor between the river and the mine. Mining did not cause water table declines in alluvial wells monitored by the mine, other than those proximate to the southern boundary of Brook 3. So I think the specific sentence that I relied on is mining did not cause water table declines in alluvial wells monitored by the mine, other than those proximate to the southern boundary of Brook 3. That's like one of the line of evidence that shows even in the case that they intercepted the alluvial aquifer. So I mean, they went there and dug there and disturbed it. And that's not the case that we are looking at with Brook mine. So even in the worst possible case of a mine mining the alluvial floor, alluvial aquifer of the alluvial sediments, their observation and data indicated to them that the drawdowns in the alluvial aquifer is not extensive. So these are like multiple lines of evidence that tells me that the predictions from Brook mine, this is lining up with what Big-Horn did 15 years ago at their site based on data that they collected at the site, not any modeling, it's data. So the data that collected from Big-Horn lines up with the model that Brook mine is proposing, or the model that Brook mine is conducted for the proposed mine site. So this, I mean, these lines of evidence tells me that increases my confidence in the model predictions.
Increases your confidence.
In the model predictions. And so I think, I mean, this is the piece that I thought this is pretty useful for me to like check against what the groundwater model said. And then there's the second piece that Mr. Redlock testified to, that the information that we should be potentially, Brook mine should have considered into the model. And I'd like to highlight the table. I think it's page 40 of the same exhibit.
Is there a particular place in this table that you'd like to highlight for the council?
So first maybe we'll highlight the table heading. So this table in the groundwater restoration document by Big-Horn summarizes the aquifer hydraulic properties conducted in the Big-Horn coal area. So they did aquifer tests in the spoils area, and what an aquifer test is, you pump a specific well in the backfill aquifer, you install monitor wells, monitor the effects of this pumping on the monitor well. And then you do some mathematical calculations, mostly curve fitting, to estimate the properties of the aquifer, specifically transmissivity of the aquifer. So I'd like to also clarify that this aquifer test, if you can highlight the date of the test here. Can you zoom in the whole row that shows the date? So the dates of these tests were 1981, 81, 82, 81, 82, 84, 84. So I'll repeat, the dates of these tests are, the first one was conducted in 75, 81, 81, 82, 81, 81, 82, 84, 84. So the point that I'd like to make is, these tests were not conducted as part of the groundwater restoration process. So these tests were not conducted in 2002. These tests were conducted in 1984 as part of the permit application and the tests that they were conducting at this site. So we know that the groundwater levels of the backfill were approximately 0 or dry in 1978. And 2002 is the time period that we know that the aquifer resaturated to pre-mining conditions. So between dry in 78 and completely saturated to pre-mining conditions in 2002, they picked the time period of 1981 through 84 to conduct these tests. So when they conducted these tests, the aquifer is not fully saturated to the pre-mining conditions. So that's an important point to remember. I mean, these tests are not conducted as part of the groundwater restoration document. These are earlier tests that were conducted in 1984, and the aquifer was nowhere closer to like pre-mining conditions. And then I'd like to highlight the transmissivity and the hydraulic conductivity rows here for the concept. So the aquifer test gives you the hydraulic, the transmissivity. So once you get the transmissivity from the calculations, you have to know the thickness of the aquifer that you're testing. So take the transmissivity value, divide it by the aquifer thickness, and that gives us the hydraulic conductivity. And that's the value that Brook Mine will be plugging into the model. So the aquifer test gives you hydraulic transmissivity. You divide it by the saturated thickness, and that gives you the hydraulic conductivity. And here in the comments, I mean, right next to all these hydraulic conductivity values, there are question marks.
You have to slow down a little.
So right next to the hydraulic conductivity values, you see question marks right next to them, but you don't see question marks right next to the transmissivity, because these are the values that they got from the test, from the calculations, the curve fitting procedures. So why did the question mark show up here? Because you can like read from the comments here, the saturated thickness is questionable. So as I mentioned before, you take the transmissivity and divide it by the saturated thickness. And the saturated thickness is questionable. Then it puts a question mark on the hydraulic conductivity, which is the key input parameter for the model. And I think, why is that not a question mark, and do we need to worry about this value without question mark? No, we don't. Because I think if you look at the specific column heading that points to this value, that's the play check bit, and that's not the pit area that we are interested in. So all the values that we are interested in for the TR1 area, they all have a question mark right next to them. And in addition to the saturated thickness being questionable, I like to maybe provide a simpler calculation for the council here. The transmissivity value is 58, and the hydraulic conductivity value is 58. So can I calculate the thickness from here? Yes, 58 divided by 58, that's 1. So the saturated thickness, and they tested this aquifer at this specific well, is 1. And we know that the current saturated thickness on an average of the site is 6 to 7. So these values are not just questionable, they're not even representative of the entire saturated thickness of interest to us. And the other thing that was brought up by the council during my direct testimony is how water vertically moves downwards once they dig in the trench, from the trench area into the coal seams. So the parameter that gives you that information is vertical hydraulic conductivity. So these tests that are conducted by BigHorn, they do not provide the vertical hydraulic conductivity. They give us the horizontal hydraulic conductivity. They give us the rates that water moves laterally, not vertically. So these tests are, to begin with, they're questionable. They're not representative of the saturated thickness that we are interested in. they are incomplete because they do not provide the vertical hydraulic connectivity information. And we can see that they provide 3 orders of magnitude variability here. So I'm not convinced that this information is reliable enough to get into the predictive model that Brook Mine is using. And the other thing that I'd like to point about vertical hydraulic conductivity is it's typically an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude lower than the horizontal hydraulic conductivity, because it's how the way the materials are laid out, and once the mine starts moving their equipments on top of the backfill over time, it gets compacted a lot more. So it's a pretty well documented fact in powder river basin mines. In the backfills, the vertical hydraulic conductivity is a lot lower than the horizontal hydraulic conductivity. So this is the piece of information that's in the GRD, but I did not recommend Brook Mine to use in their model.
A follow-up question for you, Dr. Kuchenauer. You mentioned the distinction between horizontal and vertical hydraulic conductivity. You mentioned the council had some questions about, what happens when you come into the TR1 area and dig. How does the vertical hydraulic conductivity impact the analysis of groundwater flow in the TR1 area in that respect?
Just for my own clarification, are we talking about after it's backfilled or during operations?
Both, if you would discuss.
So
During operations, as long as the mine has a water management plan and if the groundwater that's going to be intercepted is lining up with the 0.06 CFS predicted by Big Horn or the range of values that's predicted by Brook, we are looking at a relatively minimal amount of water that they can handle because of the lower permeability of the materials during operations. So during operations, it's more a mine operational procedure. How do they handle the water? How do they store the water? How do they dispose the water? How do they manage the water? But when it comes to resaturation, backfilling the aquifer, that's when the vertical hydraulic conductivity plays a significant role. Because once you put in the backfill material, where do the backfill material came from? It's the original clay that was in there, the original siltstone that was in there. They dig it out and they put it back. And typically, mines follow a pretty sequential procedure in how they lay these materials back into the aquifer for their own operational benefit. So they track where they put these materials when they dig it out, and then they also track how they put it back into the backfill. So once they put these materials back into the backfill, even though they have dug it out and changed the hydraulic properties to a certain extent, over time and how they place these materials in vertical layers using truck and shovel operations, because of the way that they place these materials, they get compacted vertically and not horizontally. So they get compacted more vertically. So in general, these materials to begin with are of low permeability than coal. So when you disturb the horizontal hydraulic conductivities might increase a little bit more, but the vertical hydraulic conductivities will not be extremely dissimilar than what you had in the background. So the vertical movement of groundwater from the Tongue River flowing through the alluvium into the backfill, getting into the TR1, and then migrating vertically downwards, we are talking about an extremely slow process of relatively minimal amount of water over time. I would not discount that there will not be any water that's seeping from the Tongue River or the alluvium or the other coal seams into the backfill over time, but it's going to be a slow process, relatively minimal amount of water.
Thank you, Dr. Kuchenauer. I want to shift gears here and discuss some of the opinions that Mr. Wireman talked about yesterday. Were you present to hear his discussion?
Yes, I was.
Did anything Mr. Wireman said change your mind about the accuracy and completeness of the Brook permit application?
So Mr. Wireman had pointed out several concerns for the council. We had two hydrogeologists or hydrologists testify before the council from the objector's point of view. One is Mr. Gerlach, and the other one is Mr. Wireman. For me, it was like a little easier, I was more readily able to provide information to the benefit of the council for Mr. Gerlach's testimony, because he pointed out a specific document readily applicable to the site, and he pointed out some specific concerns why you did not use this information. This information should have been used into the model. So it's easy for me to like wrap my head around and explain to the council why how I did this review and how I incorporated some pieces of information versus others. So it helps me to explain to the council and others how I did my job. But in Mr. Wireman's testimony, it was a lot of scientific principles based on a textbook, publications that are of general nature. So the scientific principles I agree with. But I think, the hearing has been long, and I'll be like reading closely the testimony to see like how I can like connect the dots and see like how, are there any points that I need to be concerned about for future purposes. But for the benefit of the council, I'm finding myself in a fix to offer any specific explanations.
And I apologize, I may have asked a poor question, Dr. Krishnaar. My question though is, did you hear anything from Mr. Wireman that changes your opinion on the technical adequacy of Brook's permit application?
No.
I heard we discussed when you were testifying in Sheridan about the principle of parsimony. Does the principle of parsimony inform any of your opinions about Mr. Wireman's testimony?
Thing I'd like to highlight for the councils, Brook Mine collected the baseline data that tells us what's in the ground right now. DEQ reviewed it. And then they synthesized this information into a predictive model to predict future impacts. So, definitely there are uncertainties. I consider the model as a predictive tool that gives us information and knowledge to represent reality, but it's not reality. So that's where I like to go back to the backstop mechanisms that DEQ has in place. So don't want to reiterate this phrase, but I can't help myself. We should not be losing the forest for the trees. We should not be representing a lot of technical details and heterogeneity into the model and make it so complex that we don't understand how the model behaves and make meaningful interpretations for 20 or 25 years. We are not just interested in the near future of what's happening in the next month or so. We are in charge of regulating the groundwater impacts for the next decade or however long it takes. In Big Horn's case, it took 23 years. So I think that's where I'd like to highlight that it's a model. It has its limitations, uncertainties. We should not be making it any more complex than what's dictated by what you see at the site.
Just have one other topic I want to discuss with you. That's the probable hydrologic consequences piece of the permit application. From the data provided in the Brook permit application, the publicly available data and DEQ's data, were you able to determine the probable hydrologic consequences of the proposed Brook mine?
Yes.
And I know you discussed some of this with the council back in Sheridan, but it's been a while. Can you refresh refresh everyone's mind about what areas of the permit application allow you to assess the probable hydrologic consequences.
So there are three pieces of information that I can think of. First one is the Appendix D6, the baseline hydrology. That's where they collected the water levels, the hydraulic properties, the hydrogeologic properties. So that's the basic information on hydrology and hydrogeology. And then the mine plan, it has a specific section within the mine plan that's titled as probable hydrologic impacts. So that's one other key piece of information where they predict the probable hydrologic impacts. And the last piece of information is in the reclamation plan. So the mine plan gives predicts or estimates what are the impacts during mining, during operations. And the reclamation plan, there is a specific section in there that discusses what's the impacts or how the water levels will be recovering post-mining. So these are the three pieces of information that I reviewed to help me understand the probable hydrologic consequences of the proposed mine.
Thank you, Dr. Kushner. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. So I've changed the order across just to keep everybody on their toes. Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Written some questions. I don't believe I have any additional questions to what Mr. Cope asked.
Thank you. Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you. Morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
A couple of follow-up questions. You had a nice discussion with the council about the interaction, recharge rates and things down in the TR1 area, correct?
Yes.
And the TR1 area is different from the remainder of the proposed mine area in two important ways. One, it is the only mine area laying south of the Tongue River, correct?
That's correct.
And it is also the only mine area which had been previously mined.
Previously mined by Bighorn?
Yes.
Yes.
And so in that instance, we're analyzing, and the data that comes from there is an area which has been previously strip mined and is south of the Tongue River.
That's correct, yes.
And the remainder of the mine area is different than that, correct? In those two ways.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I won't bother putting the map up again for fear that Dr. Bagley would dream of it. But we have seen the map of the AVFs and potential AVFs in the Tongue River Valley represented in DEQ exhibit number 16. You're familiar with that map, correct?
Yes.
Okay. To be clear, there was no monitoring wells ever placed within the potential AVF area. Is that right?
That's correct.
And there is no plan to put any monitoring wells within the potential AVF area, correct?
So the mine permit, the mine application currently commits to 3 monitor wells in the Tongue River alluvium. So there is a commitment from the mine as it exists right now to put 3 additional monitor wells in the Tongue River alluvium.
Okay. And that commitment could be construed as a commitment to put the 3 monitoring wells in the currently designated AVFs, correct?
Not exactly sure of those locations.
As a scientist and an engineer, Would you agree that it would be sensible and appropriate to put monitoring wells in the potential AVF?
Of the Tongue River alluvium.
Yes.
Depending on the location, they can provide useful information.
As it stands right now today, we have no baseline information about the water levels in the Tongue River potential AVF.
What question is that question?
It is.
So the information that we have is there is a perennial river that's flowing, and there is an alluvial right next to it. The alluvium water levels, on average, would be replicative of the stage elevations in the Tongue River. So once you have stage elevations in the Tongue River, you have a good understanding of the water levels in the alluvium.
To have a clear understanding of the actuals as they exist in the field, you would agree with me as a scientist and an engineer, it would be prudent to put in monitoring wells to get that baseline from the potential AVF in the Tongue River.
It's not a regulatory requirement.
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 I understand that, but my question to you is, as a scientist and an engineer, wouldn't you agree it's prudent to get the direct data?
In my role, I have to look at both regulations and science together.
So, as an engineer and a scientist, would you not agree with me that it is prudent to have monitoring wells in the Tongue River potential AVF to know precisely what the baseline is?
Well, Jeff asked and answered.
It hasn't been answered.
He just said he has to look at both regulations and his experience.
It's being asked as a yes or no question, and I'm not sure if it can be answered as a yes or no question. Dr. Kuchenauer, one more crack at it. Move on.
It's not in my job role's responsibility to ask more than what the regulations require us to do.
Isn't it part of your job to ensure that there will not be material damage to the hydrologic balance inside and outside of the permit area?
Yes.
And how will we know if there's a material damage if we do not have good baseline data to begin with?
We have the information that we need for baseline to make reasonable interpretations on the impacts to these resources.
Without that data, the operator will be free to argue that they are not the cause of the change, or that the baseline was something different than what your interpretation is.
Objection, speculation calls for him to opine about what the operator will do.
I didn't ask what the operator would do. I said the operator would be free to.
Same objection is speculating about what the operator can and can't do.
Yeah, that's a question Dr. Kuchenauer would not be able to answer. What the operator would be free to do.
Without the actual baseline data, there will be plenty of room for disagreement amongst the experts, correct?
Objection calls for him to speculate about what the experts are going to do.
Don't think it does. He's held himself out as an expert in this area. I'm asking him, without the data, then the experts can disagree, can't they?
Yeah, I'll allow that question.
Even with data experts tend to disagree.
And as it stands today, there is no commitment to put in monitoring wells in the future, which would act once mining begins, correct? In the Tongue River potential AVF.
Objection, asked and answered. He already asked about the location of potential monitoring wells and potential AVF.
Yeah, I think the answer I heard was there's no plan to put it in at this point.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Mr. Nostar, I think his testimony was that he didn't know the location.
Okay, well. Good point. I'm gonna go ahead and ask the question one more time and let us answer it one more time. Since there's a disagreement about my understanding, I guess I need clarification. Ask the question and let him answer.
You're clearly in a very sensitive area. I think you have answered the question, Doctor. Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Ms. Boomgarden.
Thank you, Dr. Bagley. Good morning, Dr. Kuchner. I have just two simple yes or no questions for you. Did you rely on a definition in the Environmental Quality Act to determine the meaning of the phrase technically adequate?
Cannot specifically recall that.
And my second question, did you rely on a definition in the Land Quality Division rules and regulations to determine the meaning of the phrase technically adequate?
I cannot recall a specific regulation.
Thank you. No further questions.
Ms. Boomgarden. Ms. Anderson.
Thank you, Dr. Bagley. Good morning, Dr. Kushner.
Good morning.
I have, my first question for you is, did you work with Mr. Pope to prepare your testimony today?
Objection, relevance.
I mean, part of what I'm getting at here is that DEQ has put themselves out as being somewhat unbiased in these proceedings and willing to work with, listen to the public and receive our information. And if they're working directly with the company to provide rebuttal evidence that impeaches that.
Dr. Bagley, I think that mischaracterizes what's happened. I don't think there's any statement that DEQ has held themselves apart from the company as part of this process. In fact, the testimony has been that they have collaborated with Brook Mine in preparing the permit application to comply with the rules and regulations. It's totally irrelevant whether Dr. Kuchenauer talked to the company about any issues.
In this case, this actually does appear to be a yes or no question. I'll allow this question. We'll see if others.
Okay, thank you. So to remind you of the question, did you work at all with Mr. Pope to prepare your testimony today?
I worked with Mr. Coleman, DQAG, in the presence of Mr. Coleman. Mr. Pope had some questions that he asked.
Okay, so he was present when you were doing your preparation for today?
For not all of my preparation, but there was a conference call that Mr. Pope was there at the AG's office.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll get to the science now, so we can talk about that. You gave some testimony about the 23 years that it took to recharge that backfill aquifer. Is that the right understanding of that? 23 years
That's correct.
Number, okay. What is Brook's estimate of recharge in this area? The number of years?
Depending on the coal seam, varies between 10 to 20 years.
10 to 20 years. Okay. Would you consider that long-term?
In a general sense, yes.
So, and we talked a little bit just now about the recharge and how to estimate the number of years for that recharge. Is there any uncertainty in those calculations and estimates?
So as noted in Bighorn's GRD, the groundwater restoration document, they acknowledge one of the uncertainties is,
I'm sorry.
they acknowledge that one of the uncertainties is when the resaturation began. So that's one uncertainty that I can think of.
Okay, how about in Brook's information? Are there any error bars related to the recharge estimates?
Yes,
What are those error bars?
that's the 10 to 20 years.
Okay, so roughly an error of 10 years.
So 10 years is for one specific coal seam, the Carney coal seam, and 20 years is for the Masters coal seam. So that in general gives you an estimate on how long it take to recharge these coal seams.
And that's for the entire permit area.
On an average, yes.
Okay, and what data was used to calculate those estimates?
Those estimates are provided as part of the predictive values that are provided by the ModFlow model. That are provided by the ModFlow model.
Was there any recharge data provided by the company for the Dietz or the Monarch coal seams?
Yes.
Okay, do you remember the offhand what those recharge values were, or the number of estimated number of years for recharge? It's okay, I know it's a long application, so if you don't remember, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure about, I think, I want to understand what recharge means, but I can't recall. That's the answer.
Okay, great. Would you generally agree as a scientist that the ability to predict long-term impacts is subject to the same uncertainties as predicting near-term impacts?
No.
And what is the difference?
Near-term impacts, like for example, the uncertainties that you deal with near-term are lesser relatively to the uncertainties that you deal with on a longer term. So as you progress with time, there's more potential for things to be uncertain.
Okay, thank you. Would you agree that the observations by Bighorn Coal in their report regarding the alluvium are qualitative and not necessarily based on empirical quantitative data?
Can you please restate the question?
Yeah, I guess I'm getting to whether you think the data regarding the alluvium that you spoke to today is qualitative or quantitative.
It's based on the information, data that they collected at the molecular wells.
Okay. All right, so going back to that a little bit, did Bighorn Coal and their data look at alluvium in Slater Creek or the potential AVFs in the Tongue River, along the Tongue River?
I did not review the AVFs.
Okay. Would you generally agree that there are, as Mr. Gilbert's just explored with you, there are currently no monitoring wells in that potential alluvial valley floor area along the Tongue River?
Yes.
Okay. My next question is, how do you determine a probable hydrologic consequences if you have no monitoring wells?
So, there are like two parts to the response to your question. Number one, there was this pre-application phase before even the mine submitted the application. The District 3 Sheridan office staff worked with the Brook mine to determine where the monitor wells need to be placed. And so I cannot speak to those, where they placed and why they placed at those locations. Item number one. So number two, from a modeling perspective, the western portions of the mine are predominantly dry. So there is lesser water from the coal seams that will be discharging into the alluvium. So from that significance perspective, I did not think the impacts at these locations are going to be significant enough for modeling purposes.
Okay. You just spoke to a meeting with the District 3 Land Quality Division office, so you weren't present at that meeting?
I was not.
Okay. And I think you gave testimony in Sheridan that kind of predated your review of the permit application, right?
That's correct.
During your review, did you ever try and revisit that decision that was made, or did you feel the need to do that?
So I asked in instances where I did not understand the rationale, I asked for justification from the mine for locations where the monitor wells were present or not. So I asked for justification for my own understanding.
Okay. As a scientist, how can you deny the importance of baseline data for the alluvial valley floor system of the Tongue River?
Objection, I don't think he said that.
I agree.
Okay.
Rephrase that question.
It's fine. I think we've covered this quite a bit, so. What data did you rely on to get aquifer thickness in the area?
So the aquifer thickness are provided in Appendix D5 of the mine permit application.
Okay. So you spoke a lot to the hydraulic conductivity data and what that means. But would you agree that a large part of that data was not obtained from site-specific baseline monitoring wells?
Can you please restate the question?
Yeah, I guess we talked a little bit in Sheridan about this too, but how many baseline monitoring wells were used to calculate hydraulic conductivity for the Brook mine permit area?
There was one aquifer test that they relied on.
Okay, thank you. All right, you spoke a little bit this morning about the amount of data in response to Mr. Wireman's testimony. I think he said, there's uncertainties, but there's some backstop mechanisms. But you made a statement that I'm interested in, and you said that the model should be dictated by what you see at the site. Would you agree that this is a complex hydrologic system?
Most hydrologic systems are complex.
Sure. Would you agree that the permit application itself calls this area complex in terms of hydrology?
Cannot recall of a specific section.
Do you remember Mr. Wireman's testimony about that yesterday?
Can't remember the exact testimony.
Okay. Well, assuming this area is complex, would you agree with me that the model should be equally complex if that's what you see at the site?
So the model should not be made any complex than what's at the site. So you should not be introducing heterogeneity or complexity into the model if it's not supported by the model's ability to represent water levels.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's get back to the regulatory requirements a little bit. So we've talked a little bit about what data's there and not there, some error bars, some estimates. Given all of this, are you still confident that the permit application prevents material damage outside the permit boundary?
Objection. I don't think he's made that determination. We talked about this yesterday.
I was writing something. Could you tell me the question again so I can hear it?
I'm asking Dr. Kuchner if he's confident still that the permit application prevents impacts to the material damage of the hydrologic balance outside the permit boundary.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I just remind you that this is something out of 406N. It's the cumulative hydrologic impact. Determination needs to be made prior to issuance, but not for technical efforts.
Oh, I know this, Jill.
Yeah,
This is
I
our
feel
issue.
like this question has been asked and answered. And, yeah, I don't know if everybody's happy with the answers they're hearing, but I've been hearing most of this. Rephrase that.
Sure. I'll ask you a different way. So you've testified that you believe the permit application is technically adequate, right?
That's correct.
Does that have anything to do with material damage prevention?
The material damage assessment is a separate assessment that relies, that's a separate assessment that relies on the permit application.
It relies on the permit application.
That's correct.
Okay, so what, in your opinion, in your review, what does it mean to be technically adequate at this stage? What does that mean in terms of prevention of material damage and what the company has and hasn't demonstrated?
The determination of technically adequate means it has met all the statutes, rules, regulations in providing all the information that we need to make an assessment.
Okay, and would you agree that an important part of the statute is to prevent material damage to the hydrologic balance outside the permit area?
There is the 406N that's in the statute.
Okay. All right. All right. Now I have some questions from the other scientists next to me. Are there any permeability tests which were taken in the fault zones? Do you remember that in the permit application?
The aquifer test that Brook relied on was closer to like one of the fault that was fault lines that was documented.
Okay, so one test.
Yes,
Okay. Do you believe that the model accounts for data in these fault zones?
yes. The ModFlow model accounts for faults and they are represented as horizontal flow barriers within the ModFlow model.
Okay. Did the model consider any subsidence effects at the permit area or potential subsidence effects?
No,
In your opinion, how is the model complete without considering potential subsidence impacts and effects?
the model relied on the information that's provided in the permit on their determination on subsidence effects.
Okay. I think that is all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Council, have any questions? Sir? Wilkie? So Dr. Kushner, thank you for doing the conversion for me today. Appreciate that. I just want to ask in general about the mod flow model and the complexity of groundwater models in general. Does the mod flow model deals with changes in time, is that correct?
Yes,
So it's got to solve a four-dimensional partial differential equation, is that correct?
yes.
So is that a trivial exercise to solve a four-dimensional partial differential equation?
It's not.
So who in this room do you think would be able to solve that?
Can say that I can.
I think you may be the only one, because I took that class a long time ago, maybe Dr. Marino can as well. It's not a trivial issue. So the question then, when you talk about ground flow model complexity, is a balancing act, is it not?
That's a great point, yes.
So when you try to get a resolution to a very small area, is that an easier situation to solve than if you're trying to do larger?
I think you're getting back, or you're sort of like getting into the grid sizes and things like that, Dr. Bagley, I assume, is that correct?
Sure, yeah.
So I think, I mean, it's if the number of grid sizes are lesser, it's easier to solve.
So I guess I just personally took some offense to people calling a ground flow model not complex. That doesn't mean that you can't always do better at ground flow model. So there's make that clarification. These are not trivial models that can solve a simple grid. I don't have any other questions. Redirect, Mr. Pope?
Briefly, thank you. Dr. Kushner, we're going to pull up on the screen DEQ Exhibit 12-144. We're going to zoom in for everybody. Dr. Kushner, based on the legend that we zoomed in on, what does DEQ Exhibit 12-144 show?
It's the operational surface water and groundwater monitoring program.
To your knowledge, does this show the locations of monitoring wells?
Yes, they do.
The reason we're here is your discussion with Mr. Gilbert's about the location of alluvial monitoring wells. Dr. Kushner, do you see any alluvial monitoring wells in the portion that we just zoomed in on?
Yes, I believe those are the purple triangles.
And you spoke with Mr. Gilbert's about DEQ Exhibit 16 and the potential ADF acreage. Do you recognize the area zoomed in on as a portion of that, near that potential ADF acreage?
That's correct.
I have a very simple question here for you based on Ms. Anderson's question about the conference call you and I had. Did I tell you what to say as part of your testimony?
No, you didn't.
Final question for you, actually. There's been some discussion about technical adequacy. What does technical adequacy mean? Does technical adequacy in the minds of DEQ indicate that a permit application is accurate and complete?
That's correct.
I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Pope. Thank you, Dr. Kuchnar.
Thank you.
Step down. Let us take a 10-minute break. Back here at 5 minutes to 10.
And why are they using
There you go. I didn't get to piss and match about the grizzly bear about who belongs on the trail.
Mr. Cole, do you have any other witnesses?
We do.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
Jeff Barron,
fair.
stand.
I don't know.
Have you raised your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Barron.
Good morning.
Welcome back to the hot seat. I'd like to start our discussion today in the TR1 area. Heard a lot of discussion in Sheridan about whether or not the permit application allows someone to figure out what's going to happen in the TR1 area. In your opinion, as the professional engineer who coordinated and assembled this permit application, does the permit allow a determination of probable hydrologic consequences of mining in the TR1 area?
It does.
How?
The TR1 area is described as a backfill area. And so we've outlined in Appendix D5 that it's comprised mostly of unconsolidated backfill material. It's very localized. It does not have any wells completed in it. Appendix D6 does not note any wells. So it's not an aquifer that's being utilized for a beneficial use of any kind. So the impacts, even if it's saturated, there's no one using it, so no one is impacted. And the permit application describes that.
In your opinion, does the lack of monitoring wells in the TR1 area hinder the determination of probable hydrologic consequences in any way?
Objection. Mr. Barron is not a hydrogeologist.
I would like to note that objection for the record as well.
Dr. Bagley, Mr. Barron is a professional engineer who prepared the permit application, participated in many of the studies, and did many of the pieces of analysis that are contained in the permit application, both about the TR1 area and about other areas.
He did not prepare this portion of the permit application, or if he did, I'd be surprised.
Any one question again?
Absolutely. My question was, in his opinion, does the lack of monitoring wells in the TR1 area hinder the ability to determine the probable hydrologic consequences of mining in that area?
Dr. Bagley, if I could also note for objection that this is in the scope of rebuttal testimony. And so the questions need to be very directly related to anything that Mr. Barron is qualified to rebut from the witnesses put on by PRBRC, the Fishers, or Bighorn Coal. This isn't a second bite at the apple for Mr. Barron to supplement his earlier testimony, and particularly an area for which he's not qualified.
Dr. Bagley, supplementing, there was evidence put on by both Mr. Sweeney and Mr. Gerlach that monitoring wells were not completed in the TR1 area. There was a back and forth about why that happened. The question still remains of whether that matters, and that's what we are rebutting here. And certainly that's the inference Bighorn Coal wishes the council to draw.
Objections are noted, but I'll let him answer to that question.
So the short answer is yes, and that is because we put monitored wells in the regional aquifer in the area, the Kearney Coal.
Mr. Barron, you mentioned regional aquifer. That's something that I don't think was clear in previous discussions about the TR1 area. How large is the TR1 area compared to the rest of the proposed permit area?
So if you wanted to describe the TR1 area compared to the permit application, the TR1 area would be this stack of papers on my desk, as opposed to this room that would be representative of the permit application area.
Do you know, in terms of acres, about how many acres the TR1 area encompasses?
Probably covers a quarter of a square mile.
And for probably need to do math, so I'm going to avoid doing that. Can you convert that to acres for us, please?
Yeah, 100 acres or so.
How many acres are in the proposed permit area?
Approximately 4,400 acres.
Given the relative size of the TR1 area to the overall permit, what does that mean about the probable hydrologic impacts of the mine in the TR1 area?
In the TR1 area, the mine would have minimal impacts.
Let's talk about breaking the seal. That was a question posed both by objectors and by members of the council about the effect of mining in the TR1 area. Can Brook, as part of its reclamation, restore the seal, and in fact, restore the lack of hydrologic connection between the upper area of the TR1 and the lower area?
We could, yes.
How could you do that?
We could special handle some material. There is clay throughout the permit area, and even in the TR1 area, we could take clay that we have removed and store it separately, and then put that clay back in a somewhat compacted fashion and reestablish that low permeability zone.
In your previous experience with mining operations, have you ever done special handling?
Yes.
Where?
I've done it in Cordero Mine, Black Thunder Mine, Eagle Butte Mine.
Were those special handling efforts successful?
They were.
We're going to put up on the screen regulation. Can you zoom into the type of piece there? This is Chapter 2, Section 4 of the coal regulations. I'd like to go to a specific portion that Bighorn Coal discussed up in Sheridan. This section here says that for the proposed permit area, and by extrapolation to adjacent areas, characterization of the geologic strata down to and including the deeper of either the strata immediately below the lowest coal seam to be mined, or any aquifer below the lowest coal seam to be mined, which may be adversely impacted by mining. Does the permit application characterize these geologic strata?
It does.
Where?
You would find those in both Appendix D5 and Appendix D6.
Continuing on with this part of the regulation, which was discussed by Mr. Gregerson, it then says this information shall include a statement of the results of test borings or core samples which have been collected and analyzed to show, in subpart A is location in groundwater. Does the permit application include a statement of the results of test borings or core samples which have been collected and analyzed to show location of groundwater?
It does.
Where are those?
Those again are in Appendix D5 and Appendix D6.
There were some questions by Mr. Gregerson about the lack of test borings or core samples in sections 15 and 22. Mr. Barron, to be very clear, I am not asking you to draw any legal conclusions, interpret the statute. Do you see anywhere, the regulation, do you see anywhere in this regulation that requires a section by section sampling?
No.
Are you aware in your review of Wyoming statutes or regulations that requires a section by section sampling for test borings in any way?
No.
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about alluvial valley floors. We're going to pull up DEQ Exhibit 12-144. Mr. Barron, do you recognize this as the map that I spoke with Dr. Kuchenauer about?
I do, yes.
Does this show the proposed alluvial monitoring wells?
It does.
Where are, and you have a laser pointer up there, Mr. Barron, can you please point to where the proposed alluvial monitoring wells are? If you need us to zoom in, let me know.
One up on the screen, there's one located just south of the permit boundary in that location. There's also one south in section 24. And then, might need to zoom up, but I think there's a third one. And there's one at the intersection right there.
Are any of those proposed monitoring wells within the potential AVF acreage we've seen on DEQ Exhibit 16?
Two of them are.
I'm going to shift gears here, and I'm going to bounce around on subjects with you, Mr. Barron, so please bear with me. There's a lot of discussion in the previous hearing days about Brook's interaction with the public. Did you ever meet with any members of the public on behalf of Brook Mine?
I interacted with members of the public at a meeting that the PRBRC held at the public library. I interacted with the public at a county commissioners meeting. I had some interaction with a single individual who called me in reference to the permit application. I also interacted with an older lady who emailed me and had some questions on the permit application. I also interacted. One resident had a concern that his well wasn't listed in the permit application. We researched that and found that the well was mischaracterized on the SEO database. We corrected the record, offered to study that well for that individual, and we were refused to do that study. But on several instances, I've interacted with the public
If a member of the public had wanted to find out information about the Brook permit application, could they have called you or met with you?
Throughout the whole permitting process, even before we submitted to DEQ, I maintained an open door policy.
How would someone have known that they should contact you in particular?
After the submittal, the initial submittal of the permit application, there was a public notice in the newspaper saying the permit had been submitted at DEQ. The documents had our company name in and amongst those, as well as my name on those documents that I signed.
Let's talk about well drawdown. We've heard some concerns about the potential impacts of the Brook mine on domestic wells. In particular, we heard some discussion about Mr. Booyak's well and Mrs. Fisher's well. I'm going to talk to you about each of those wells. Are you familiar with information about Mr. Booyak's well?
The information on his well is, again, stored at the state engineer's office. And so, yes, I am aware of that information.
What is the predicted drawdown in the area around Mr. Booyak's well?
With the groundwater model, we did some prediction on drawdowns. The furthest extent is a 10-foot drawdown ring. You can assume at some length beyond that, there's a 5-foot drawdown. So in the case of Mr. Booyak, it's assumed that there's somewhere between a 0 and 5-foot drawdown.
Do you know the height of the water column in Mr. Booyak's well?
It was listed in the SEO data.
What is the height of that water column?
If I recall, it's about 15 feet from the surface.
What is the depth of Mr. Booyak's well?
I believe his well is about 190 feet deep.
We heard some discussion about locations of pumps in a well and how that could affect drawdown. Do you know the location of the pump in Mr. Booyak's well?
Mr. Booyak's pump is a couple of feet from the bottom of the well.
Based on the information you described from the state engineer's office and the information and predictions in the permit application, what is your opinion about the effect of the Brook mine on Mr. Booyak's well?
Objection. Again, Mr. Barron is not a hydrogeologist. This is testimony outside his area of expertise.
Who joined that objection?
Actually, everybody wasn't paying attention to that. It sounded like he answered by saying a prediction of 0 to 5-foot drawdown. So I don't know.
He did say that, Dr. Bagley. What I'm getting at, I guess, and maybe I didn't ask a good enough question. Perhaps the question, Mr. Barron, and it may draw the same objection as we tried. Based on the information available from the state engineer's office and the information available in the Brook permit application, does that data show whether Mr. Booyak will still have water available in his well?
Objection. This data from the SEO has nothing to do with the mine. This requires a conclusion that the witness is not qualified to make.
Dr. Bagley,
I'm going to actually sustain the objection because I don't believe he can make that answer based on my understanding of the data as an engineer. So, move on to another question.
okay. Well, actually, shift gears here, Mr. Barron, and talk about Mrs. Fisher's well. And then we'll probably end up at the same place.
Yep.
We'll get it. Do you know, is there public information about Mrs. Fisher's water wells?
Yes, there is.
Where is that information?
That is at the state engineer's office.
Does that information show the depth of Mrs. Fisher's well?
It does.
And I apologize, I've been saying wells and well. How many well or wells does Mrs. Fisher have?
I'm aware of 2.
Does the information on the state engineer's office website provide information about where the pumps are located in those wells?
It does. An applicant for a water well with the state has to submit a notice of completion once the well has been drilled. And it has details of both the location of the water column and the pump in the well.
Where is the pump in the 2 Fisher wells?
Again, both wells are a few feet off the bottom of the well.
Does the information on the state engineer's website contain the depth of those wells?
It does.
Does it show the height of the water column?
It does.
I think we'll draw the same objection, so I won't ask you to render that final opinion. But I would like to talk to you while we're on the subject of water wells about recharge. We've heard a little bit about it, but in the context, in the general context of the permit application, what is recharge?
So recharge in the permit application deals with an aquifer and its ability to receive new waters or waters that are already in the aquifer to fill areas that have been dewatered.
Dr. Kuchenauer discussed that there's a 10 to 20 year recharge prediction in the permit application. Where is that prediction in the permit application?
That's found in an addendum within the mine plan.
In the context of domestic water wells, why is it important to understand the recharge after mining?
And I'll raise the same objection. This calls for a conclusion that the witness is not qualified to make.
Dr. Bagley, he's a professional engineer. He studied and put together this permit application, including the data about recharge. He's qualified to talk at least on a general level about what that means.
Let me hear the question again.
Sure. In the context of domestic water wells, what is the importance of understanding the recharge after Brook mines?
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. Go ahead and objection noted. Go ahead and ask the question.
So in the first sense, we do a prediction to understand what effect and what drawdown we may have on a well, but we want to understand how long before that well will recover. The case of John Bouillac's well, where it's a 0 to 5 foot drawdown, we would want to know how many years before that comes back.
If I'm a landowner who has a domestic well, based on the data in the permit application, can I figure out how long it'll take before the drawdown in my well comes back?
Yes.
We talked about Mr. Bouillac. I want to just wrap up on a couple of points about him, clarify some of the testimony he shared. And did Brook require Mr. Bouillac to drop his objections when Brook offered to include his house within the half-mile buffer?
We did not.
Were you present when Mr. Bouillac expressed concerns about the legal issues surrounding including his house within the half-mile buffer?
Yes.
To your understanding as an expert in the permitting process, if Brook includes Mr. Bouillac's house within the half-mile buffer in the permit, can he, for example, request a pre-blast survey?
He could, yes.
Why?
Because he would be, if we offered and included him in the half-mile boundary, then that becomes an enforceable action by DEQ within the permit doc.
So we talked about pre-blast surveys. Let's shift a little bit and talk about blasting. There was discussion by Mr. Enney that the blasting that the Brook mine will do is overburden and coal blasting. Have you ever witnessed overburden or coal blasting?
I have, yes.
Where did you witness that?
Cordero Mine.
Do you recall how close you were when you witnessed those blasts?
Within 1,000 feet.
We've heard a lot of discussion about what blasting may feel like. As someone who's actually been there, what did that blast feel like?
To be honest with you, when we were there, I didn't feel the blast more than I observed the blast at the time.
Could you clarify for the council what you mean by that?
I didn't feel a noticeable vibration on the ground, but I did witness a cloud of dust that came up from the blast.
Are you familiar with the Wyodak mine?
Yes.
Where is the Wyodak mine?
Near the city of Gillette.
How close to Gillette is the Wyodak mine?
Immediately adjacent to it.
Is it close to I-90?
It is
You know how close?
within a few hundred feet.
Do they do cast blasting at the Wyodak mine, to your knowledge?
Yes,
And is I think we heard some discussion about this, but is cast blasting more powerful than overburden or coal blasting?
there's more explosive used, and so the general assumption is yes.
To your knowledge, given their proximity to I-90, has the Wyodak mine ever had to shut the interstate down to do cast blasting?
Objection relevance. I'm not sure what the practices of some other mine have to do with this permit application.
I wonder if someone would object to that. Actually, I agree. The Wyodak mine is out east of Gillette. This one is sharing with geography, geology.
Understanding that, Dr. Bagley, the point here is there have been, particularly by some of the landowners in the area, concerns about the effect of blasting. In fact, Ms. Malone, in her objection letter and in her direct testimony, discussed closing the interstate. What effect would that have on it? This is an example of a mine, coal mine, that uses a more powerful blasting technique closer to inhabited areas, including I-90. It's relevant for the council to compare the effects of blasting at that area to the blasting concerns expressed as part of this hearing.
Now, we got to figure out another way to get at this. I was wondering when someone was going to object, but let the lawyers do
Fair enough.
that.
Well, I think we can move on from that subject. Let's talk about subsidence. Dr. Marino discussed his opinions about high wall mining and room and pillar mining, and that he believed they were the same. Do you share that opinion?
I don't believe that they're exactly the same.
Why not?
Mostly because room and pillar has a set of hallways and then perpendicular cuts that are different from high wall mining. High wall mining is merely just a hallway cut into a full.
Does that difference matter in determining the potential risk of subsidence?
Objection. Mr. Barron did not prepare the subsidence control plan for the company. He has no expertise on subsidence prevention or mitigation or assessing that risk, as was discussed in detail in Sheridan.
Dr. Bagley, Mr. Barron is a professional engineer who analyzed the subsidence control plan, who analyzed the subsidence control statutes and regulations.
But he did not put his professional engineer stamp on the subsidence control plan.
Understanding that, Dr. Bagley, Mr. Barron has also testified that he took training courses on subsidence. This is a very general question about mining methodology and how that relates to subsidence. I'm not asking you to do the hard science.
I want to hear the question again, please.
Sure. Is the difference between high wall mining and room and pillar mining important in assessing the risk of subsidence?
Yeah, I'll allow that question.
Yes.
Why?
In our subsidence control plan, we go through a narrative describing the historic mining subsidence in the area. Outside of retreat mining, where we pull the pillars, in areas where the pillars weren't pulled, the subsidence control plan discusses at those intersections, those perpendicular intersects. That's another place where subsidence was likely to occur and did occur. As a matter of fact, the subsidence control plan lists a map with an overlay of historic subsidence compared to a map of the underground mining that took place in that area and describes that very thing happening.
Since we're on the subject of subsidence, in your preparation of the permit application, did you review the statutes and regulations concerning the subsidence control plan?
I did, yes.
What do those statutes and regulations require?
An objection to the extent this calls for a legal conclusion,
Dr. Bagley?
or to the extent it requires Mr. Barron to interpret subsidence risk or prevention, that he's not qualified to make those conclusions.
Let me hear the question again.
I asked him, what are the statutes and regulations? What do the statutes and regulations require for a subsidence control plan? Mr. Barron testified that he is an expert in the permitting process that was qualified during his direct testimony in Sheridan. He just said that he reviewed these particular statutes and regulations. And at the end of the day, part of what this hearing is measuring what's in the permit application against what's in the statutes and regulations. It is an unavoidable question, both for the council and witnesses, about what does that require?
Well, it's not our fault that they don't have Cardno and their consultants that actually
I've heard your
prepared.
Objection.
Yeah.
And this question is really, to me, if you list the things that are in a regulation, not a legal opinion, I'll allow this question.
Do you need to repeat the question?
Please.
Okay. What does Wyoming statutes and regulations require for a subsidence control plan?
They're very brief, and they require that a subsidence control plan be submitted.
I'd like to clarify something that Dr. Marino discussed, and that's the extraction ratios in the permit application. The phrase that was brought up was coal recovery efficiency is 45 to 60%. Do you recall that testimony?
I do, yes.
As the person who prepared the permit application, does that in any way refer to extraction ratios?
It directly relates to it.
How so?
In the permit application, the recovery efficiency is also the extraction ratio. Dr. Marino went to describe as a recovery efficiency loss of coal during the mining process. You might have some fines that are lost, but in the permit application, that's not what that's described.
So is it, and I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page on this, does Brook plan to have an extraction ratio of 45 to 60%?
I believe it's 40 to 60%, but yes.
Thank you for that clarification. There's been a lot of discussion by Dr. Marino about ground control plan versus subsidence control plan, why work wasn't done in certain places. Why is it that the Brook mine decided to do the engineering Dr. Marino discussed in these ground control plan rather than a subsidence control plan?
And I would just raise an objection that he's asked to give an opinion on behalf of the company. He doesn't actually work for the company.
He prepared the permit application. He was the permit coordinator for the Brook mine. He was the ultimate decision maker in terms of how the permit was going to be put together. This is a question of why those decisions were made.
Can I hear that question again?
Sure. The question is, why did Brook, in preparing his permit application, decide to do the engineering work that Dr. Marino discussed as part of the ground control plan rather than the subsidence control plan?
Yeah, I don't think he can answer that question. I mean, you asked why did Brook?
But I'll lay some foundation before I get to that question. I think that might help us. Mr. Barron, were you involved in the decision-making process about how to engineer for the risks of subsidence?
Yes.
Were you involved in decisions related to doing engineering studies as part of a ground control plan?
Yes.
Were you involved in decisions about doing that work in the ground control plan rather than in the subsidence control plan?
Yes.
Why, based on your experience in that decision-making process, is the engineering work going to be done as part of the ground control plan rather than the subsidence control plan?
In this case, it was a question of permitting efficiency. And so because the regulations required the submittal of a subsidence control plan, but doesn't have a lot of detail on what that required, we in essence wanted to kill two birds with one stone and put the detail in the ground control plan that already requires a great level of detail. And then we could add to that as necessary for the permit application.
Will you be involved in preparing the MSHA ground control plan?
Yes.
What will your role be?
My role in preparing the ground control plan will be conducting all of the studies the geotechnical engineering surrounding the ground control plan, and likely I'll be signing the document.
As part of doing those geotechnical studies, will there be an analysis of how to create a ground control plan to prevent subsidence?
Yes.
Why?
One, it's a requirement of the ground control plan. As far as if you connect the dots between addressing the factor of safety surrounding the mining in the area and related to subsidence, and certainly because the permit application, we'll want to bolster that. And so we will connect the dot from just a factor of safety to miners back to subsidence for the permit application.
There was some discussion by Dr. Marino about short-term versus long-term. How does what you just said relate to the short-term versus long-term?
Dr. Marino pointed out that the 1.3 factor of safety is a short-term factor of safety. And in the effort to kill two birds with one stone, and Dr. Marino went to a description of several types of factors of safety from 1.5 to 2.0 that could be a long-term factor of safety. Those will be included in the permit or in the ground control plan and then subsequently included in the permit application.
So just so we're clear, will Brook engineer its ground control plan for both the short and the long term?
Yes.
There was discussion about a minimum required safety factor of 1.3. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Can Brook, as part of the ground control plan, engineer a higher safety factor?
Yes.
Will Brook?
For the short term, we will stick with the 1.3 factor of safety. But as we investigate each one of these panels and it's determined that it needs to be larger, then we will certainly make it larger.
Let's talk about the ARPS program for a moment. I want to clarify a few things with you. Are you familiar with the ARPS program?
I am, yes.
How so?
I've got a version of it on my computer at my office.
Have you used the program?
I have.
There was discussion about the ARPS program and how it relates to sub-bituminous and bituminous coal. Can you clarify how the program works in regards to those two types of coal?
So the program has in it a list of default values that you can use. And depending on the coal, you can pick strength parameters based on default values. So in the case of subbituminous coal, I think there may be even one or none in the program, if I remember right. Subbituminous coal, as far as its strength parameters, is the default value in the program.
In preparing the ground control plan, will you rely on those default values?
No, we'll use tested values from the field.
Let's talk about the permitting process at a broader level. Were you present when several witnesses in Sheridan suggested that they wish the permitting process had more protection for landowners?
Yes.
Do you agree that the permitting process does not protect landowners?
No.
Why not?
So when SMACRA was passed and then Wyoming adopted those rules to obtain primacy, one of the primary objectives of the rulemaking that the lawmakers did was to protect landowners.
Can you give us some specific examples of either statutory or regulatory requirements that protect landowners?
One, there's a discussion on do we materially damage an area, and we have to study that and offer those protections outside of the permit map. Those are discussed in the legislation and in the rules.
We've heard a lot about the Brook Mine commitment to replace water quality and water quantity. Do you believe that's another landowner protection?
Yes.
While we're on the subject of permit commitments, There's been allegations and frankly, sort of the undercurrent of this entire hearing about whether Brook will live up to those commitments. I want to talk to you about a couple specific ones. The first is there was an allegation made that Brook could take more coal out of the ground than what is stated in its application. Do you remember that?
I do.
Is that true?
No.
Why not?
One, we have put forth a permit application that describes exactly what we're going to do. We live under the oversight of DEQ, and although we don't report to them on a daily basis, the mine will collect records of extraction on a daily basis, and at any time, DEQ can view those and establish whether we're doing what we said we were going to do.
Does the mining equipment that Brook intends to use assist in the collection of that data?
It does. It collects data minute by minute as it mines.
Will that data be available to DEQ?
Yes.
I have to ask you a very general statement here, Mr. Barron. You prepared this permit application. You have interacted with the company representatives of Brook. Will Brook follow the permit commitments in its permit application?
Objection. That's complete speculation. Again, Mr. Barron does not work for the company. He will not be doing actually the mining. He will not be the mine plan manager. He can't speak to this.
I agree. This, how would he know? Very respectfully.
Okay. Unfortunately, that means we'll have to call another witness, but so be it. Mr. Barron, there is a board behind you. I want to turn to that board in just a second, but Brook has a burden of proof in this hearing. In particular, one of the things that Brook has to demonstrate is that everything in the statutes and regulations is included within the permit application. Are you aware of a document that DEQ publishes that explains what must be in a permit application?
I am, yes.
Dr. Bagley, with permission to approach the witness?
Yes.
Mr. Barron, I've just handed you the document. What is that document?
This document is the completeness criteria as published by DEQ.
Are you familiar with this document?
Very.
How so?
I use this document on a regular basis in preparing permit applications, amendments, on substantial revisions.
What does this document explain?
This document is a list of what is required for a permit application to mine coal in the state of Wyoming.
Does the completeness criteria indicate what statutes and regulations require certain parts to be in a permit application?
It does. In the back of this document, I think section 4 cross-references all of the requirements to Wyoming statutes, rules, and regulations.
Dr. Bagley, we would offer this into evidence as Brook. We're at 15.
You have to mark a copy. Any,
I'm sorry, Brook 14.
any objections? All right, accepted.
We'll mark that in just a moment. Word 14. Mr. Barron, what is the date of the completeness criteria?
August of 1995.
So we were just talking that it includes cross-references to statutes. Are the statutes referenced in section 4 the most recent versions of statutes and regulations?
They are not in some cases.
So how, in using this completeness criteria, do you account for that difference?
So I regularly go to the legislative website and cross-check for updated rules and regulations as they compare to this document.
You mentioned that the completeness criteria explains what must be in a permit application. Does the Brook permit application mirror the requirements contained in the completeness criteria document?
It does.
Does it follow the same structure as what's in the completeness criteria document?
It does.
Are you aware that DEQ conducts a completeness review of a permit application?
Yes, I am.
What is a completeness review?
Objection.
I'm gonna get.
Dr.
Okay.
Begley, one, I think we're well beyond the scope of rebuttal. And second, the completeness determination by DEQ is not the same as the technical adequacy determination that is at issue under the regulations and statutes here. And thirdly, I think we're getting into an area where it's prejudicial to the other parties because they're asking this witness to essentially provide a oral closing
Right.
that none of the other parties have been allowed to provide.
That's exactly what I'm
Dr.
saying.
Bagley,
And there's a-
And we would join in on objection, just to put it on the record. That's exactly what I was going to say.
I would further that to say, you know, this is supposed to be rebuttal. No other witness has talked about this document. It's not rebuttal. Again, it's just an effort to backfill the prior testimony and also perform some form of closing
Yeah.
that the other parties aren't going to get. So, yeah, I object to it.
Dr. Bagley, the objector's case has been that the permit application is deficient. This document speaks to the technical adequacy, and as we heard from Dr. Kuchenauer, the accuracy and completeness, which is a statutory requirement. And yes, part of this does speak to our burden of proof. That's the whole point of having this hearing, to have that discussed. We are discussing that burden of proof as it applies to the objections that have been raised, and we are going to rebut those specifically. But for the council's benefit, we want to explain the completeness process as Mr. Barron understands.
And that is something we can do in a post-hearing brief.
Let me rehear the question.
The question was, what does DEQ conduct a completeness review of the permit application?
Yeah, but this isn't a DEQ witness, so I agree, we'll sustain the objections.
Let's turn to the board behind you, Mr. Barron. Do you recognize that board?
Yes.
How do you recognize that board?
Well, I helped prepare it.
All right. At the top, it says 406N states in part, I'd like to turn to the first Romanette, that the application is accurate and complete. There's a chart under there. What is that chart?
That chart contains a list of some of the pieces that are listed in the completeness criteria. And then it further in the blue letter text describes where in the permit application those can be found.
I'm going to wait in again with an objection. Rebuttal is a very specific thing, and that is the ability to have witnesses recalled to address something that was presented by these other parties during their cases in chief. And so I know what Mr. Pope is going to say. We have a right to come in and defend that we have a complete permit. But at this point in time, that right is limited to responding to criticisms directly that were made by the objectors in their presentations of their case in chief. Not an opportunity to go back and revisit the entire plan and do a second go at why this is complete. It needs to be restricted to responding to the evidence presented by the objectors. And this is just an overall, we're going to talk about everything again. We're not going to talk about the specifics. If they got specific questions, that's okay. And I got to say, this is just a very clever way to try and do a closing argument when there isn't one allowed. So I object. It's not rebuttal.
Okay,
Yeah, and we would ask
two
such a-
objections, 3 objections. Mr. Gilbert, you had a comment.
I mean, it seemed like yesterday, and I might ask them to just look at the PowerPoint that's sitting here
You may.
on the table. Seems like I recall that yesterday's presentation or PowerPoint identified 406N as being one of the main concerns that the Powder River Basin Resource Council put with the doctor's testimony, that he identified on numerous occasions that he was concerned about.
You might be confusing Dr. Marino with Mr. Wireman, but
Okay, that was still your witness and was still that presentation, so. When I see 406N up there, and we're talking about rebuttal, I fail to see what the objection is.
I think if it's limited to the scope of what we talked about yesterday and specific, as Mr. Gilbert said,
Okay, so-
we'll see those questions, but
Let's hear what Mr. Phil has to say.
Dr. Bagley, as a general principle, I don't disagree that rebuttal should be limited to the evidence presented. The reason I asked Mr. Barron that previous question, and he answered that it's some, that table is limited to the areas of objections. And as those apply to the accurate and completeness of the Brook permit application. We only intend with this chart to discuss areas that were brought up by objectors as part of this hearing. So that is proper rebuttal.
So, let the lawyers argue about what belongs to the rebuttal, but I'm not changing the law. What I don't want to hear is a complete rehash of all this stuff. You said it today. I got a pretty good handle on what is and is not been done. And I'm beginning to think that folks are trying to waste my time. So that by itself is troublesome. I'm going to allow you to talk briefly about this. We need to keep it very short because I have seen a lot of presentation and evidence from everybody on all of these issues. I don't need to hear it all again. I don't really need to hear too much more again. In fact, I'm not sure I need to hear anything more again, but allow you guys to.
I appreciate that, Dr. Bagley. We will not rehash anything. Ms. Speck will post me if I get anywhere close to that. Mr. Barron, in the interest of efficiency, does that chart identify areas that have been objected to in the permit application?
Yes.
What is the blue ink in that chart? What is the text in the blue ink tell someone looking at that chart?
That's where you can find those components addressed in the permit application.
Mr. Barron, we were going to have you check some boxes. We are not going to do that. Mr.
That's
Sussman would be
good.
terribly disappointed, but we're not going to do that. To wrap up with you, are you aware of any permit conditions that have been suggested by the objectors that, in your opinion, is required to make the Brook permit application accurate and complete?
No.
No further questions. Oh, and actually, before I yield the floor, we would offer that as a demonstrative exhibit, Brook D15.
All right.
can we put a D on there? Just so it's
Yeah,
clear?
D15.
Okay, thank you.
No objection to it being received as demonstrative.
Right.
Okay, accept it. All right, thank you, Mr. Poe. Mr. Coleman. All right, thank you. Mr. Gilbert.
I have no questions for this witness.
Thank you. Ms. Boomgarden.
Thank you, just a few.
Morning, Mr. Barron.
Good morning.
We can agree, can't we, that the TR1 area is that area at the confluence of Goose Creek and the Tongue River?
Yes,
And we can also agree that the TR1 area is the first area that Brook intends to mine?
yes.
Can you please tell me where in the permit application it describes, as you testified this morning, how Brook can use special handling to fix the seal?
There's not a discussion specifically on the CO, but we do have the ability to special handle material.
And we can agree, I believe, based on body of testimony at this hearing, that the geologic strata across the permit area is not homogeneous. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you tell me where in appendices D5 and D6, each of the heterogeneous characteristics were sampled and analyzed?
They're found in the addendum to those appendices.
And same two questions that I asked Dr. Kuchnar. Did you rely on a definition in the Wyoming Environmental Quality Act to determine what the phrase technically adequate means?
I'm going to object to that. We've established that technically adequate is a DEQ term. As the council ruled, he's not a DEQ list.
I disagree. I don't think anybody has said it's a DEQ term. Dr. Kuchnar said he couldn't recall relying on anything, and he answered Mr. Pope's question on redirect. This is a different witness, and who, as we know, has been charged with the responsibility for developing this permit application. I'd like to know whether he relied on a definition.
And it's the very subject of this hearing, I would just add.
Could I hear the question again?
Yes. Did you rely on a definition from the Wyoming Environmental Quality Act to determine what the phrase technically adequate means?
Yeah, I'll allow that question.
No, technically,
Thank you. Did you rely on a definition in the Land Quality Division Rules and Regulations to determine what the phrase technically adequate means?
no.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Booker. Ms. Anderson?
Thank you, Dr. Bagley. I just have a few questions for you. Mr. Barron, good morning. I think it's still morning.
Hope it's not after.
Okay. You talked a little bit about Mr. Buyak's house and the half-mile buffer around the permit boundary. And you testified to a commitment made by the company and maybe yourself directly on behalf of the company that, you'd kind of fudge the line a little bit and allow Mr. Buyak's house within that buffer, right?
We've made no such commitment at this time.
Okay, so it's not currently in the permit application at this time to allow Mr. Buyak's house to be considered for the purposes of the law, really, within that half-mile buffer?
No.
Okay. You testified a little bit to the idea that, you're waiting for the ground control plan from MSHA because you wanted to kill two birds with one stone. I think that was your testimony, right?
No, we're not waiting on a ground control plan from MSHA.
Okay, so did you testify that, you're trying to kill two birds with one stone here?
Yes.
What did you mean by that if there's not a ground control plan right now for this permit application and all this stuff up here on the chart?
A ground control plan does not need to be submitted as part of this permit application for DEQ.
Okay, but how are you relying on it then for the subsidence control plan?
Rephrase the question, please.
Yeah, so you were saying that the ground control plan is killing two birds with one stone. And I'm assuming that the two birds are both the ground control plan and the permit application, right?
No.
So what are the two birds?
So the two birds are on the discussion of subsidence. The permit application has a subsidence control plan. DEQ has made a request of some additional information for mining in a specific area. The ground control plan is for each specific panel, and there is a ground control plan that will need to be submitted for each individual panel. So we have committed in the permit application to provide that data when we submit the ground control plan. It's reviewed by MSHA and then approved, and that becomes part of the permit application. So the additional detail that DEQ requested as part of its technical review of the permit, we have committed to providing, and they have found that response adequate.
Okay, but just to be very clear, it's not part of the permit application right now.
No.
Okay. And when that additional data is submitted to DEQ, will the public have a chance to review this data and information?
Once it's submitted to DEQ, it becomes part of the public record, and anyone at the public can review it at any time.
Are you aware whether it'll be a major or a minor modification to the permit?
My general sense is it'll probably be a minor modification to the permit.
So that doesn't mean that does that mean that there won't be an opportunity for objections and comments officially into DEQ from the public?
Objection. That's a question of DEQ processes, and it's also not part of what he discussed on, correct? It's not DEQ person, so we can speak to that.
Yeah, I agree. Since he's not DEQ, we wouldn't know.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Barron, have you prepared any other ground control plans for MSHA permits?
Yes.
For high wall mines specifically?
No.
So this would be the first one that you would do?
Yes.
For a high wall mine? Okay, I have a somewhat technical question. What difference in the stability calculations are made from more conventional and high wall versus rim and pillar mines, and what are those differences?
Objection, Dr. Bagley. This is what was objected to on direct, that he isn't the subsidence control expert. Those questions, when I asked them, are not allowed. It wouldn't be fair to allow those kind of technical questions now on cross.
So my question, I may ask a different question just to clear this all up.
Okay.
And I appreciate what Mr. Pope just said. That actually is interesting. Okay. Mr. Barron, did you perform the ARMS calculations for this permit application?
I did not.
You did not. Okay. Oh, okay. And if you didn't, why weren't these calculations provided for review in the permit application?
Those calculations will be part of the ground control plan. They have not yet been conducted.
Okay. Anything? No? Any good? Just give me one moment to consult. Mr. Barron, do you know if the ARMS program determines floor and roof stability?
I do not believe that it does.
Okay, thank you. I think that is all the questions we have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Anderson. Council, any questions? I do have a question. So, Mr. Barron, you mentioned at different times you were available to the public. Did you or Brook Mine host any informational meetings with the public as part of while this process was going on, while the mine permit application was being prepared?
I did not.
Are you aware if Brook Mine did?
I am not aware.
Thank you. That was all the questions I had. Mr. Pope?
I have no redirect questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Barron.
Thank you.
Sit down. Let us take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11:10. Any other witnesses?
Brook line rests.
Oh, thank you. Good. So I want to thank everybody for their presentations and the time and effort everybody's put into this. So due to the length and complexity of this case, it has been pretty long. I'm going to have parties prepare written proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law instead of doing oral closings. It's my understanding that the transcript will be ready sometime around the end of June. We don't know the exact date, but that's the time frame we're looking at. So the parties will have 20 calendar days after notification by council staff that the transcript is available to file their proposed findings and conclusions of law. And there may also be additional information requested. I'll get to that in a minute. We will issue an order notifying the parties that the transcript is available, and the order will contain the filing date for the findings of fact and conclusions of law. Those documents we're expecting to be in the order of 40 pages. We will finalize that in detail in a minute, as I'll explain. Proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law should be focused on the law that is applicable to this case, which includes citations to specify specific legal requirements, statutes, and rules that the council is required to consider to decide this matter. The proposed findings of facts and conclusions of law must also include necessary facts cited to in the transcript to support your legal conclusions. Because there was also testimony about possible permit conditions or changes, the proposed findings, facts, and conclusions of law should also identify suggested changes or conditions that a party requests the council to consider in the legal grounds for such a condition to be part of the permit. Now, as we've been listening, the council has had some additional questions that we've come up with. We will be preparing a order on this briefing to be submitted to you early next week. And I will clarify some of the additional questions that we have, and we will be requesting you to brief us on. So that will be available early next week. We have to finalize that document. And in that, we will also further clarify lengths of pages and things. I was thinking in the order of 40 pages. I was told that one page was not long enough. So we got to go longer than that. So I guess the short answer is you might be able to take tomorrow off, but that's up to you. Because all the council members were not present to hear all of the evidence in this case during the entire final hearing, those council members will have to read and review all of the evidence, including the transcript upon it being done, and or listen to the audio video recording of the hearing. I believe Mr. Gopian wanted to see it all live, so here he has been watching it live. It's always better live. This matter shall remain open until the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of the law have been filed with the council, and the council has had an opportunity to read them. We will target our August meeting for final deliberations and vote on this matter. If we can do that earlier, we will, and of course, we will let all parties know. At the time of deliberations, at that point, we will be closing the hearing, but it is not closed now. The meeting date for those who are trying to plan is currently for the first week in August. We have another meeting scheduled. The exact dates of that are still being finalized, but that is when we're targeting to be able to also finalize this. Are there any final questions? Yes, Mr. Coleman.
Hearing officer, thank you. DEQ has thought about the idea of proposed conditions and appreciates the council inviting those. And we have suggested, some revisions ourselves through a proposed change. But one thing that we're concerned about is making sure that the proposed changes or the conditions that the council might accept in place upon the permit would be ones that we can enforce that are practical and also that we have the legal authority as DEQ to enforce. And therefore, not trying to create significant amount of additional filings or paper. We would ask that the council build into this process an ability for the parties to comment to the council at some point, in some form, comment prior to the council approving changes, if necessary, if they're concerned about the practicality of those conditions, improvements in the wording of those conditions, or just a general concern that there's not a legal authority to enforce those conditions. I would like to say that DEQ would just provide those comments, but I'm certain that the other parties are also interested in trying to have a say in that. So we would ask that for all parties.
All right. Thank you for that comment. We'll take that under advisement since the hearing is still open. As we continue forward, we'll examine the potential for that. Thank you very much. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for your patience. This hearing is recessed.
I got this in my ear.